I'm still pulling myself together emotionally from the band's last song, Peace Came Down. It's kind of amazing when you think about it, what 2 million plus streams on Spotify and iTunes and all the gifts and abilities they have and all the hours they put in to come here every Sunday. Can we thank the music team for doing an incredible job? Yeah. I find myself clapping my chest right now, and I'm not exactly sure why, but I did it. So, can't take it back. I love that song because it talks about the fact that in a world that feels sometimes out of control, we have a God who's completely in control. You know, and it kind of reminds me a little bit about what Leah was talking about in her announcements about the fact we have a baptism coming up. In a world that's completely out of control sometimes, we have a God who is completely in control. And he just asks us to follow him one next step at a time. So I don't know where you are at in your spiritual journey. I don't know whether you've been a Christian for like 10 years and you just never got around to getting baptized, or whether you're one of the people that committed your life to Jesus last week. Whatever it is for you, I'm convinced that in a world that can be really confusing, here's something simple. Just follow Jesus one next step at a time. So if you haven't been baptized yet, sign up today. Text DUNK to that number, 604-670-3040. So our guest speaker today is George Franco. I met George first in the fall of 2014. He came up from the United States to help us work on a campaign called Bold. Came up with a guy named Joe Sangl. Bold was really interesting, kind of based on that passage out of Joshua chapter 1. Be bold and strong, banish fear and doubt, for remember the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And it's that sense that we had as a church that we want to prepare to put our foot down in the city and say that we're not just here for today and tomorrow, we're here for generations, you know? But it was a tough campaign because it was completely vision-based. We knew that it wasn't our final step. So it was like, hey, Bold, could you please give? We're going to build something sometime and somewhere. So if that's concrete enough for you, let's go. And it was amazing. And part of the reason it was amazing is because in the fall of 2014, George Franco came up along with Joe Sangl. And they helped us prepare to launch the Bold campaign. Now, I don't know if you've ever met Joe Sangl. Joe Sangl is energetic. That's an understatement. He's quite loud and enthusiastic, and it's awesome. So I remember meeting with George and with Joe, and Joe was just loud and enthusiastic, and I think like a couple times every hour he would yell, "If I'm lying, I'm dying." You know, that's Joe. "If I'm lying, I'm dying." And I'm like, yeah, wow, it's awesome, you know. And then George Franco was there, and George Franco, he wasn't as loud as Joe. No one I've met so far in my life is necessarily as loud as Joe, and that's awesome. But here's what I noticed about George is like, every time Joe would take a break, or George was presenting, or we'd be in a break, George would walk over and he would say, "How are you doing?" Now, like, how are you really doing? Because this is a big step for your church. You've never had a home before. Feeling intimidated? Can I pray for you? How can I help? Any questions I can answer. And so as the week went on, we got to know Joe real well, and that was awesome. We got to know George real well. And I remember one night, I was sitting with Dave Poole, and I said, "Dave, what do you think of these two? You know, Joe and George." And Dave says, "Man, I love Joe. I love that guy so much. He's so enthusiastic. He's so passionate. It's awesome." I said, "Yeah, me too." He said, "But can I tell you something? I feel even more connected, and I really, really love George." I said, "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." And at that time, I don't think we could have articulated it, but I know now what it was. I know now that it was a divine appointment that George Franco showed up here in the fall of 2014. And it wasn't just for the Bold campaign. It's amazing when you think about it, to go from Bold, you know, we're going to build something somewhere, sometime, and years later, 5 years later, here we are, and the shovels are in the ground, and we're moving towards that home. It's awesome, and that's important. But George's impact on this church has even been more than that. Remember those bracelets you used to see a lot? WWJD, what would Jesus do? For myself, I ask myself the question a lot, how would Jesus lead? And when I want to know how would Jesus lead, the first person I look to is George Franco. We had a chance to, George has been up lots of times since the fall of 2014. Got a chance to meet his wife, Tara. In fact, Tara's here. Can we welcome Tara Franco here? Well, yeah. See, that's why I clapped my chest last time, because that doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of hours I spent on the phone with George Franco over the years, talking about being a child of God, talking about being a pastor, talking about being a husband, talking about being a dad. He's one of my best friends. And what's amazing to me is, as I introduce him to you, is some of you don't even know him. And yet the impact that he's had on this church and this mission has been incredible. So the bumper for the sermon series is going to play, and then George is going to come up here. And he's a friend of mine, but he's also a friend of Southside Church. So when the bumper stops playing and George steps up, let's welcome him like a friend. Thanks.
Trying to think of a phrase that would be good. The idea that sometimes we think that we need to transcend our experience, or we would even like to transcend our experience and be something else, or be somewhere else, or not be at all, is really sad when we consider that Jesus came in the flesh, that the incarnation was about God being with us, and part of that divine plan is that we're actually frail, and that we feel, and sometimes we hurt, and that all of those things are okay, and they are something that defines our humanity, that will connect us with God, because it's God who made us and breathed life into us and made us human and said it was good.
Hey, Southside. All right. Wow. Hey, I'm not gonna lie about anything today, so trust me 100%. This has been the biggest date that I've been looking for a long time. When Mike called me and said, hey, could you come up and visit me at Southside and speak? I was like, yes. And it wasn't because I'm a great speaker and I love to get on stage and speak. In fact, I don't do it that often, but I just wanted to come and be part of the Southside family and see my friends and see what was happening in the church. Some amazing things have been happening at Southside since we met in 2014, and I just wanted to see it physically with my eyes. I feel like to some degree, Paul in the New Testament, when he'd travel around to different churches and get to see what God was doing in different areas, Southside is the place that I always want to come and see. It's really one of my favorite churches, if not the favorite church that I have in the world today. And Mike, what a great leader that you guys have in Mike. And I just want to take a minute and really honor Mike. He has been a friend for a while, but as I watch him lead the church from the early days here at Southside to where you're at today, to where God's got this church pointed in the near future, he's an absolutely amazing leader. I've traveled all over the country, all over the world. I've been with Joe Sengel in a lot of different churches. I've been in Central America, Honduras, Costa Rica, and lots of different churches scattered through those countries, down into all parts of Africa, Burundi, South Africa. I've been into Egypt. I've been into the places where churches were destroyed by the rebellion. There's guys standing outside with guns underneath their robes trying to protect the churches so that people can come hear the message of Jesus in a Muslim world. I've been in Eastern Europe, which is a really dark and cold place. Literally, it's dark and cold, but in Serbia, for example, a place that I've been able to help plant a church, it was the place that was the coldest to me because the spiritual temperature was cold. Like there was no conversation going on about God. People aren't interested in who God is or what place he has in their life, or even if he really exists. They just think life is what it is, and they really need to know Jesus. And so I've been all over the world and seen some of the great leaders who are leading the church today, but I really do mean this this, and I'm sincere. There's not a better leader that you could have than Pastor Mike. And I just want to take a minute and honor him and the Southside staff. They're an amazing team. Can we just celebrate their leadership, their commitment, and they love each and every one of you. Yeah, they're awesome. I really love Southside Church. And so I've been listening to this message series, Becoming Human. It's really an amazing series. And it's this part where our human stories, our lives kind of intersect with this divine God. And God shows up in these amazing ways. And we get to hear it through real life stories, through people's experiences of God. And we get to relate. Like we get to think about, how does that connect to me? What's my perspective of that? Is it similar to my story, some things that are going on in my life? And I always think that when we listen to those stories, there's these little snippets, there's these little parts where we're like, yeah, that sounds like me, or I went through something like that, or I experienced something like that, or I had a friend who went through something like that. And we begin to relate to one another in these really amazing, powerful ways. And so when I got here this morning, I did this mic check and I walked up on stage and there's this beautiful young lady and I said, hi. And she goes, my name's Maddie. And I said, I know what your name is. You're amazing. God's done some amazing things through you. And if you came here today and you said, I don't know if God's real, I don't know if he's doing miracles today, if God's really big in life, then all you have to do is go back a couple weeks and listen to Maddie Hardy's story. It's absolutely amazing and powerful. And then last week, there's this young kid who gets up here. His name's Lucas Manis. And like, I've known Mike for a long time. I've come to Southside several times. And every time I come, Mike starts bragging about his son who plays basketball and he's great. He can hit all the shots. And I'm like, yeah, Mike, yeah. But I never met this kid named Lucas. And I'm like, I wonder if Lucas is even real. And so Mike would say, hey, he's going through some stuff in life. Can you pray for him? So I pray for him. But last week I got to hear Lucas's story, which I've been a very small part along the journey, praying for him along the way. And how powerful is it to know that God knows exactly where we're at, no matter if we're faking it on the outside and making everybody believe that life is awesome and good, or whether or not on the inside life isn't so great. And we're really struggling with some things, our identity and eventually our purpose. And Lucas showed us that even in the darkest moments, that God knows exactly where we're at and that he calls us into something bigger and greater into life. And Lucas found his purpose, his calling, what God had designed him and equipped him to do. And God has a plan for you. And we learned that last week with Lucas. And it was powerful. I love this part where it's okay to not be okay, because it's in those moments where we can actually hear God's voice and God can begin to move and work in our lives. And so it's just been an awesome series. And it reminded me that there's these mountaintop moments in life and there's these valley moments in life. And we heard good stories of exciting things like winning championships and how great young life is. And then we've heard these moments of cancer and of depression and discouragement along the way. And I was like, life really is kind of mountaintops and valleys. Or in some ways we could say, like Pastor Mike was saying right before I came up here, that sometimes life seems out of control. But then there's other times in life where it seems like, hey, everything's under control. It's going really well. I think everything's okay. And it reminded me of this story of this boy named Cody and this girl named Abby. And Cody, he had his eyes on Abby. He was like, man, she is pretty, she's cute, she's everything that I want to date. I want to be around this girl. And he worked the angle, man. He got as close to her as he could. He hung around all the time, but he couldn't get the nerve to ask Abby out. And so one day they're hanging out together and Abby said to Cody, she said, hey, Cody, do you want to come over for dinner tonight? And Cody's like, yes, I do. And he was excited. He was like, finally, the moment has come. I'm going to get to hang out with this girl. Maybe we'll take the next step in our relationship. And so Cody does what every great young man does. He runs downtown to the candy shop and he walks in, tells the candy store owner, he's like, hey, I got a hot date tonight. I need some candy. And he said, I want your small box of chocolates. And the candy store owner goes, okay, yep, here's a small box of chocolates. And when he handed it to the boy, he said, or to Cody, he said, Cody goes, hey, I'd like a medium-sized box of chocolates. Do you have that too? And the candy store owner is like, yeah, I have a box of chocolate that'd be a little bit bigger than the one that I gave you. And he looked at the boy and he said, Cody, he said, this must be a special girl. Something special must be happening. He's like, yeah. And he said, now wait, I want a large box of chocolates too. And the candy store owner was like, okay. And Cody said, so see, here's the plan. I got this date tonight. This girl invited me over to her house. I'm going to go have dinner with her family. And I'm buying a small box of chocolates because, if the night goes really well and everything's good, I'm just going to give her a small box of chocolates to be sweet and special and say thanks for having me over. But if after dinner we go into the living room and we get to hold hands, he said, I'm going to give her the medium box of chocolates because that'll be a great night. And the owner's like, okay, so what's the big box of chocolates for? And he goes, well, the big box of chocolates is if I get a kiss goodnight. Like that, she's gonna get a big box of chocolate. It's gonna be a really special evening. So Cody grabs his 3 boxes of chocolates, runs out of the candy store, goes down to Abby's house. The parents come to the front door and greet him, and he comes into the house and they say, hey, let's go to the dining room. Let's eat dinner together. And so, the dining room is a place for family. It's a place of closeness where you're breaking bread together and sharing intimate moments. And so as they sit down at the table, the dad looks at Cody and says, hey, Cody, why don't you do me a favor? Why don't you pray tonight? And so Cody, he bows his head and he starts praying. And his prayer is deep. It's meaningful. It's super spiritual. He's really laying it out in front of God. God, thank you for this food. And thank you for this great house and these beautiful people who love you, God. And he's just going through his prayer. And they got done with dinner. And Abby and Cody go into the living room, and Abby looks at Cody and goes, oh my goodness, Cody, I didn't know that you could pray. That was such a beautiful prayer, and you were going on and on. I didn't know that you could pray. And Cody looked at Abby for a minute and goes, Abby, I didn't know that your dad owned a candy store. And so it might take you a minute to catch up with that, but in a moment, Cody was so excited. He had a mountaintop experience. Abby wanted to spend time with Cody, and she invited him to her house, and Cody's on cloud 9, and he runs down to the candy store. It's a candy store moment in life. But a few moments later, he comes to at the dinner table moment, a dinner table moment where all of a sudden there's a little anxiety in his life where life all of a sudden seems out of control. He can't control the circumstances because he's exposed, and there's no other way out but then to pray and to say, hey, God, show up and do something special here. And that made his prayer probably a lot longer and more eloquent in nature. And sometimes that's the way it is in our life. When life is going really well, when we're on top of the mountain and everything seems fine, we're not really looking for God. We're not having conversations with God. We're not really talking to him about these mountaintop candy store moment experiences in life. But there are times in life that when we enter into the valley, when we come to a dinner table moment, that we begin to say, uh-oh, God, things are out of control. God, I need your help. God, can you show up in a big way? And we begin to ask these questions, and we begin to look to God for new ways. And so in my life, I've just realized that there are these mountaintops and these valleys that come. I realize that there's moments where I'm running to the candy store and there's moments where I'm sitting at the dinner table. And I don't know if you guys have found that true in your life, but it started early in my life. I grew up in a Christian home. I got saved at an early age. But in my teenage years, I really kind of fell away from God. And my parents forced me to go to this Christian college. And I made a deal with them that I go for 1 year. And while I was there, I was breaking every single rule that I could. They had all the Christian rules. And I was like, check, got that one. I break everything that I could possibly break. And I never got caught, so there was no ever penalty or consequence to it. And then one day I was out on this, they had a lake, it was frozen, and we were just fooling around, kind of playing. In America, it wasn't real hockey for those Canadians here. But I met this girl, and her name was Tara, and we started hanging out together, and I really liked her. I was like, oh my gosh, this girl is awesome. And we were hanging out one night and she did something that was really cute and funny. And I started laughing and the words, I love you, came out of my mouth. And I didn't mean to say it. It was just natural. And I was really attracted to her and everything that she did I thought was awesome. And I said, I love you. And it was crickets. She didn't say anything. And I was like, uh-oh. I'm in big trouble. This is not going to end well for me. And there's just silence for a while. And all of a sudden, Tara, she looks at me and she says, George, I really enjoy hanging out with you. We have a lot of fun, and I could see that this relationship could go somewhere in life. And she said, but my biggest concern about you is that you're not a spiritual leader. And Tara right away helped me refocus my priorities in life and said, hey, there's some things that are more important than our relationship. And the question is, how is your relationship with God first before I want to engage in a deeper relationship with you? And so I went through a season of evaluation, of prayer, and really it was a season where God spoke to me in new ways and things got back on track with me and God. And Tara and I started dating officially, and about a year later we got engaged, and a year later we were married between our sophomore and junior year in college. We were young, but it was awesome. Like, we had our apartment, we had our friends would come over, we'd have movie nights, and school was going well. A year after we get married, Tara comes to me on my anniversary, and she hands me this little box, which I thought was gonna be a really cool gift. And I open it, and it's this little plastic stick, and I'm like, what is this? And I flipped it over, and it was an early pregnancy test. And she goes, we're pregnant. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's gonna be so awesome. We're adding to our family. We're gonna have our first baby. And it was a little unnerving because we were still in school, but I was like, this is gonna be so cool to see what God does in our family. And I get to graduation, I graduate, and I'm excited about the next chapter. Like, life couldn't be really any better. We were young, we were having fun, we had a growing family, and I was like, it's really good. It was a candy store moment in the Franco household. And then right after graduation, I started not feeling well. I noticed that I was tired and fatigued a lot, that I would sit down and I'd fall asleep watching television, or if we got in the car and Tara or someone else was driving, I would fall asleep really quickly. And then I noticed that at nighttime, that every time that I wake up in the morning, I'd look at the sheets and they were just soaking wet. Like, I'd sweat all through the night. And I was like, it's really strange. I'm not running a fever. You know, I don't feel sick, as we kind of define sick, but I don't feel right either. And my skin became super sensitive. I'd play sports, and we'd play basketball, and I'd set a pick, and somebody would come across me, and I was like, oh, you know, everything just sore on my skin. That's kind of weird. And so I go to our family doctor, and he started looking at me, and he said, hey, you know, there are some things that don't seem quite right. We're going to send you to a specialist to look at some things. And so I go to the specialist, and he begins to do all kinds of tests. That's what specialists do. They test you a lot. And he comes back to me and says, hey, you know what? We think there are some abnormalities. And I think where we're at with your diagnosis is that we're going to go ahead and do an exploratory surgery. And when we get in there, we'll take a look around, and we'll see if everything's okay. If it's not, we'll do a surgery. Hopefully everything will be fine after that. And so they scheduled a surgery. My daughter is a couple months old at that point. We got some friends to come watch her, and my wife takes me into the hospital. I go in for surgery. I wake up, and I've got this ice pack in my lap, and I'm like, okay, something happened. I don't know what. No nurse came to me. No doctor came to me to tell me what the next steps were. They just basically came with a wheelchair and wheeled me out into our car. And so I get into the car, we get about 2 or 3 blocks away, and I said to Tara, I said, I guess they did surgery and maybe removed something. And she was like, she pulled over the car, and I'll never forget, we had a white car, and her face and skin color went as white as our car was. And she said, George, nobody talked to you? And I'm like, no. And she said, you have cancer. And she said they don't know how far it's spread or how big it is, but they know for sure it's definitely cancer, and they're running all kinds of different tests to figure out what they do next. And so all of a sudden, we're in the valley. We're sitting at the dinner table. We're young. Everything was just good. Like, I literally woke up and everything was good. I went to the hospital feeling like everything was going to be good, but in a moment, I wake up out of surgery. I'm in a car, and I'm being told that I have cancer, and everything's beginning to change. And I feel like I'm headed for a valley. And over the next several days, we ended up at a cancer clinic in Indiana. It's one of the best in the world. And what the doctors in Ohio, where we were living at the time, had told me was that after they had done their test, that they had found a little bit of cancer. I had testicular cancer, and what they had found was there was a little bit of cancer that had spread to my groin area. And the doctor said, what we want to do is that we want to cut you from your sternum to your groin. We want to remove all of your lymph nodes. A lymphectomy is what they called it. And they're like, it's a 6-month recovery process. There's a chance you'll never, ever be able to have children again. You'll have to go through several blood transfusions along the way. And it's still a higher risk surgery, even though we think we can get all the cancer. And so I said, hey, we want to get a second opinion. And so we were able to get into this clinic in Indianapolis, which was about 20 to 30 miles from where I grew up. And It's the best treatment center in the world for this type of cancer. I didn't think I'd be able to get in. We made a phone call on a Monday. We started praying about it. We made a phone call on Monday. And when I talked to the lady, she said, can you be here on Friday? And I'm like, yes, we'll be there. And so I remember we were in the basement of this big medical facility, and the surgeon comes in and he grabs these test results, these CAT scans that we had brought, and he puts them up on the wall. And I was sitting in the room, and I looked out in the hall, and I was watching him, and he would just go down slide by slide by slide, and he'd look at it. And he came in and he said, hey, Mr. Franco, what do you know about your cancer? So I gave him the whole down low, like I'm a doctor. And I said, yeah, it's no big deal, a little bit of cancer, a little lymphectomy, and I'll be as good as new. And he goes, hey, I don't know what your doctor's experience is in Ohio, but we deal with this every single day. We're the best in the world at it. And when I look at these scans, there's cancer everywhere in your body. And we need to get you in for a brain CAT scan to see if it's spread to your brain. And I'm like, what? And he said, yeah. He said, right now, without knowing what's in your brain, he said, we're going to diagnose you as stage 4 cancer. And we need to start radical chemotherapy immediately. Like, we want to start it today, if you can stay here today and start on it. But he said, if you have questions, we'll give you the weekend, a couple days to think about it. But on Monday morning at the latest, you need to start aggressive chemotherapy. And so that Monday, we checked into the hospital, and they begin this heavy regimen of chemotherapy. It is one of the strongest cocktails of cancer treatment that you can get. And so for every 20 hours, I would get this radioactive cocktail that would be injected into my body. And the first day, you feel kind of okay. As soon as the drugs hit your veins and get into your bloodstream, you begin to taste a metallic taste. Your taste changes. Water doesn't taste the same. Food doesn't taste the same. By day number 2, you begin to be sick to your stomach. And day 2, 3, 4, 5, you're throwing up. And you throw up, and it's not like when you got the flu. You throw up and you feel a little bit better. It's that you throw up and you feel like you could do it again and again and again. Your stomach doesn't settle. And for days and days and days after treatment, you'd feel the same way. And then you get a short period of recovery and you go back and you do it again. And you go through the same cycle. A few days later, you get a little bit of recovery time, and then you go back through the cycle again. And so before long, I'd gone through the whole regimen. I was towards the end of my treatment, and the doctor came into my room and said, hey, Mr. Franco, he's like, we got your CAT scan results back, and the good news is that you're completely clean. All this cancer that had spread through your entire body, he said, it's completely gone. The chemotherapy has done its job. We think that you need about 4 years. And in about 4 years, we would consider you cured of this type of cancer. And, because of the surgery that you had and the radical chemotherapy, you're not going to be able to have children for a while and maybe not be able to have children again. Your chances after a year are about 50-50 of having children again. And so all of a sudden, Tara and I are looking at one another going, oh my gosh, I've been healed of cancer. Like, you have so many cancer stories in life. We heard the story of Maddie. I bet as we go through this room today, and those who may be listening to the podcast, there's somebody in your life that's experienced cancer. It's one of the things that almost everybody has in common, is that we know somebody who's been through that journey. And Tara and I are looking at each other going, oh my gosh, we're on a mountaintop. We're on a high. We're excited about what God's doing in our lives. And we're at the candy store. And so in the days to come, like, I had lost a lot of weight. I had lost my hair. I was bald then and bald now. And so I was like, nobody's going to want to hire me. And shortly after I'd finished chemotherapy, a company, a really well-known company, came and offered me a job, one of the best paying jobs in our community. And I had this amazing job. A year from the last chemotherapy treatment, my wife came to me. She handed me another little box. And this time when I opened it and saw this little stick, I knew exactly what it was. And when the doctor said that we couldn't have kids, they didn't know what God was up to, because we were pregnant with our son. And then we bought a house, and everything was going really, really well. We were back on the mountaintop. Things were going really, really good. And I was like, God, this is so awesome. And it wasn't long after that I came home from work one day. It had been one of those really long weeks at work, and I came home and I just wasn't feeling well. And I put my bag down and I sat down on the floor, and I told my wife, I said, hey, something doesn't feel right. I don't feel good. And she said, maybe you're just tired. I'm making dinner. It'll be ready in a moment. And then all of a sudden, I felt my heart start racing. Like my It was beating and pounding. I could feel it through my chest. And then all of a sudden, my hands got really sweaty, and I had beads of sweat break out on my forehead, and I got really clammy, and I was like, something's not right. Something's going wrong. And I told Tara, I said, hey, I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm having a heart attack. Maybe it's the chemo drugs. I don't know, but like, you better get me to the hospital really quick. And so she got a neighbor to come watch our kids. She throws me in the car. She rushes me to the hospital. The doctors start doing the things that doctors do. They do all these different tests. They start observing me, and they were gone for a little bit. And finally, they came into the room to deliver the bad news to me. And they said, hey, Mr. Franco, we've gone through all of your test results, and we've been observing you for a little bit. Given your past history, right, we want to make sure that we really study things carefully and understand what's going on in your body. And they're like, it looks like that you've had a panic attack. And I said, a what? And they're like, a panic attack. And I'm like, no, there's probably cancer in my brain, or maybe I have it in my spine, or maybe there's something bigger going on. Maybe it's in my sinus cavity because I had a sinus infection. I was like, there's got to be something more wrong with me than a panic attack. And they're like, no. They're like, it's pretty common. Sometimes worry and anxiety, they build up in your body, and they create this physical response to it that feels like a heart attack, looks like a heart attack, but it's not really a heart attack. And like, you didn't have a heart attack. You don't have cancer in your body. You're a pretty healthy person. And they're like, hey, you can go home, relax, try and de-stress, relax in life. And I'm like, this is crazy. Like if you're worried about something, you just tell your mind not to worry anymore, and you don't worry. And so they send me home, and a few days later, another panic attack comes. Heart racing, sweaty, clammy, feel like I'm going to die. Something's got to be wrong with me. And so I was on a mission for months, going to doctor's offices. Like, my doctor, I think, had a standing order for me that I'd show up on Mondays and Fridays, right? Because I got off the weekend and I said, I know what's wrong. It's like, it's definitely in my spine. There's probably a tumor down here in my lower back, or, I'm pretty sure it's in my brain because, I feel a little dizzy, or I feel a little nauseous, and that's got to be a tumor in my brain. And so my doctor, he was really pleasant. He would run and order any test that I would ask for, and he said, hey, we're going to figure it out. We're just going to give you confidence that everything's okay with your body. And every time that I'd have a panic attack, I'd show up at the doctor's office, and he would say, hey, you're a perfectly healthy person. You just have worry and anxiety, or somewhere in your nervous system, they're building up, and it's triggering this physical response to what's happening. And so anxiety began to get worse and worse. And maybe some of you have experienced the same thing, that it becomes so overwhelming, so controlling of your body, that it began to affect my schedule. It began to affect my work. And what I did, I began to change things. I felt like if I was out of control, if my mind or body was out of control, and I couldn't control its thoughts, I could control other things around me. I could control my schedule, what I did and where I went. But my challenge was that when we'd go out to eat, for example, we'd be in a restaurant, and it'd get noisy and loud, and all of a sudden I could feel my heart start racing, and I'd break out in a sweat, and I felt that anxiousness coming, and I'd say to myself, you're okay, there's nothing wrong with you, you're a perfectly healthy person. But that didn't stop the anxiety from growing inside of me. And my wife had learned over time that I would do this thing. I would rub the back of my head, and when I rubbed the back of my head, she knew that I was getting ready to have a big panic attack, and so she would ask for the check, grab our kids, throw them into the car, and then she would take me home and try and help me through the next 15, 20, 30 minutes, sometimes hour or longer, till my body would calm back down. Anxiety was beginning to control everything in my life. There was one time where my wife said, hey, I need to run down to the store for a little bit. And she said, can you just watch the kids for 5 minutes? I'll be down in the store. I'll be right back. And she knew that I got anxious when she would leave, or if something changed in the schedule that I couldn't control along the way. And she said, look, I'm just down the road. I'll be right back. And I'm like, okay, I think I'll be fine. And so she leaves. She comes back home, and there are both of our kids sitting on the couch watching cartoons, laughing, having a good time. And she's like, hey, where's your dad? And they're like, we don't know. We haven't seen him. And so she goes rushing through the house to try and find me, and she's tearing through the rooms, and she finally gets to our bedroom. And in the bedroom corner, I was curled up in the fetal position with a blanket over my head in a full sweat, with my heart racing and pounding, in the middle of a big panic attack. And no matter what I did, as hard as I worked to control my work schedule, when I traveled, when I didn't travel, what I ate, when I exercised, all the things I did in life, I was trying to hold on and say, hey, I'm in control of this. I can fix it. I can do it. it didn't beat the worry and fear and anxiety that I was having in my life. And so I went to my family doctor and I said, I must be going crazy. There's something wrong with me. I can't fix this. And he said, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you on some medication. We're going to try and help get the anxiety under control a little bit. We're going to send you to Christian counseling, and we're going to kind of sort out some of those responses that are happening in your brain, because this idea, like fear is a known threat. We know when we're afraid of something, we know that that dog can bite us. Like he's growling, he's licking his chops at me. He could reach out and bite my leg. That's a real reason to have fear. It's a good, healthy response for us. But anxiety is an unknown or undefined threat. And what I was beginning to do in life was I was taking these circumstances in my life around cancer or health, and I was beginning to put my own thoughts about what was happening in my body that weren't real. My wife calls it, I call it rationalizing. My wife called it awfulizing. I was awfulizing the things in life, thinking that the worst things were going to happen. And the amazing thing is that God had just done something miraculous in my life. He had healed me of stage 4 cancer. There's not a lot of people in life that can say that. I'd had this high mountaintop experience, but now I find myself in the valley wondering if God's going to show up. And I'm like, God, I really believe that you can show up and heal me, that you can take care of this anxiety and worry. You can take it off of me. And then I'm like, God, I think you can take this worry and anxiety off me. God, will you take the worry and anxiety off me? God, maybe you're not going to take the worry and anxiety off me. Maybe you're not going to do it. And what I forgot was God works differently. Like God's past performance in my life is absolutely a predictor of his future performance in my life. Unlike the stock market, we say, hey, if you're going to invest in something, just because it did good before doesn't mean it'll do good again. But God is faithful in our life. He was faithful yesterday, he's faithful today, and he's faithful tomorrow. Even though we can't always see how it's going to end, even though we can't control the outcomes in life, we have no control over things, God is in control. And so over the next several months, I began to learn, and over the next several years after that, and even today, I'm continuing to learn to trust that God is good and that he is in control and I don't control things, and that he has a plan, much like we heard from Lucas and Maddie already. And anxiety began to fade. It's not always gone. It comes up from time to time, but anxiety began to fade, and I'm like, okay, I'm coming back to the mountaintop. Life is good, and life has been really, really good until about 16 years ago, my dad called me one day and said, hey, George, I got some news to share with you. I went to the doctor today. I haven't been feeling well, and I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And little did I know that 20 years before that God was going to put cancer in my life, that my dad would stand at the foot of my bed in a hospital with tears in his eyes and say, I wish that I could have the cancer and not you. Like no dad should see his son pass away before he goes. And he's like, I just want cancer. I want it. I don't want you to have cancer. And I didn't know that God was preparing me. I was the first one in our entire family who had ever had cancer. There'd been no history of cancer in our family at all. And God had been preparing me to go through a journey with my dad, the guy that I really loved the most and cared about the most. And so over the next several days and months and years, Dad would go through all kinds of different treatments. The first thing he did was this thing called a seed implant. They go in and implant these little radioactive seeds into your prostate. They emanate a lot of radiation and hopefully eliminate the cancer in your body. And it seemed to work. And for about 2 years, everything was good. And then all of a sudden he went in for a checkup and his blood markers started going up. And so the doctor said, hey, now we're limited in what we can do. They went to a cryosurgery where they go in and they freeze the prostate, try and kill all the cancer, and then everything was good for 2 years. And then it wasn't. And then the doctor said, now we're really limited. The only thing that we can really do right now is hormone therapy, where basically they start injecting the male body with estrogen because prostate cancer lives off of testosterone. And so they're injecting him with estrogen. And like ladies, like I totally relate going through the journey with my dad, the hormone fluctuations, because like he had hot flashes and sweats and mood swings and all kinds of things. And I'm like, Dad, like it's gonna be okay. Like this is the thing that's gonna beat the cancer along the way. We've got this, like it's gonna happen. And about 2 years later, his markers started to go up again. And the doctors came and said, hey, there's not anything else we can really do for your dad. And so What we do believe at some point, we don't know exactly where the cancer is in his body now, like the prostate's been frozen and all those things have been done and we've done the hormone treatments, but at some point that cancer is going to show up in his body. It'll metastasize somewhere and then we'll have one more shot at trying to cut it out. And so in January of 2010, I was asleep at night in my home in North Carolina, and I had this weird dream. I dreamt that I walked into a room and I saw my mom and my dad, and they were talking to a lady. And the lady said, "Hey, Joyce, your boys really like their dad a lot," because I have an older brother. And my mom looked at her and was just really smiling. She said, "No, my boys don't like their dad. They love their dad." And immediately my cell phone rang. I sat up in bed. It was 5:30 in the morning. I said, "Something's wrong with my dad." I grabbed the phone. I looked at it. It was my mom. And she said, "George, something is wrong with your dad. I need your help." And so they lived in rural Indiana out on a farm. And she said, "I don't know what to do." And I said, "Mom, hang up, call 911. And I said, first, what's wrong with Dad?" And she said, he woke up to go to the bathroom, and he got up and he couldn't walk. She said he fell here on the floor, and he's saying that he can't move his legs, he can't feel anything. And he went to bed at night, his legs functioning perfectly fine. He woke up in the morning and the cancer had metastasized to his spinal cord, choked it off enough that he had no movement from the waist down, and he was laying on the floor helpless. And so she called 911. They race him to a hospital. I jump on a plane. I fly up. As I hit the ground, I find out they took him to the hospital that I was treated at. And so I go rushing into this room, and when I open the door, I'm not sure what to expect. There's my dad in the hospital bed, and on the other side of him was Dr. Leahy, the doctor who treated me for testicular cancer. And he's like, "Hey, I think I know you." And I'm like, "You do know me. We spent a lot of time together." And he's like, "Hey, like, we got this. Like, this tumor's big. It's around your dad's spinal cord. We're going to cut it out. Like, it's going to be good." And he said, "Hey, when you're being treated, there's this surgeon that's well known, and he's one of the best in the region, and he's actually on call tonight. He's going to do your dad's surgery." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, God, like, you've been aligning these things for a long time, over 20 years. And you've put me in the spot to go on the journey with my dad." And so they cut the tumor out. He regained use of his legs for a short period of time, but the cancer kept growing and getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, the doctors are like, "There is nothing else that we can do. We can't cut it out. We can't radiate it. We can't do anything. Your dad's gonna die." And so the cancer had attacked his colon. He had a colostomy bag. My mom was trying to care for a farm. She's trying to care for their business. She's trying to care for my dad. She calls me one day and says, "Hey, will you come and get us? I can't do this anymore." And so I fly from North Carolina to Indiana, pick up my dad. I take him back to North Carolina. And I went to a doctor that we knew, and I said, "Hey, we know it's bad. We know there's nothing we can do, but we don't know like how much time he's got." And he said, "Come into my office." And he opened, he pulled me up to the computer screen, and he said, "Here are your dad's scans." And he started clicking through the pictures, and picture after picture, my dad had cancer in every single one of them. And so I took Dad home into my house and cared for him for about 3 or 4 days, and he finally passed away in my home. And it was really one of the most awesome times in my entire life. That in a season when my life seemed out of control, that God was in control, and he saw and knew exactly how he was going to use me to impact someone else's life. And it got to be my dad, the guy that I cared and loved for the most. And so in the days to come, we'd fly him back to Indiana, bury him a few miles away from our farm. You could actually see our farm, the place that I grew up, and spent a lot of time with my dad from his burial site. And in the weeks to come right after that, we sold off all the personal property. We had this big auction. And it really is something about the accumulation of things, right? Because he spent 70 some years of his life accumulating stuff. And really in less than a day, everything that he had owned and everything that he had worked for was sold for fractions of a penny. And a couple weeks after that, they had the real estate auction. And I told my wife, I said, "Hey, I just need some time just to celebrate my dad and to remember like the good times that we had in this farm that I grew up in." And I said, "I'm going to fly up early." And so I got there. It was a fall afternoon. All the crops had been harvested. And I remember going up to this 1800s farmhouse and walking in. And I walked through every single room of the farmhouse. I mean, I went into the restrooms, I went into the closets, I went into the bedrooms. In the living room, I remembered the spot as a little boy when I was 5 or 6 years old. I knelt down and said to my mom, "Mom, I don't know what it is to know Jesus. Can you help me with that?" And we prayed, and I asked Jesus to come into my heart. I went out to our barn. I walked through the barn. I walked through the chicken coop. I walked through our garage. I walked through every acre of land. I hopped the creek. I jumped the fences. I wanted to take it all in. I remembered where the apple orchard was that got cut down years before. And I just remember some good times that my dad and I had. And I saved the last place to come to was his shop. It was the place where he earned his living. We repaired trucks and tractors and heavy equipment. And so as I came to the shop, the one thing I want you guys to know about my dad is that I grew up in this business working on trucks and tractors, and it was a really special time because it was just me and my dad. My dad called me his backup man, and anything that would go wrong, it was George. George is my backup man. He'll take care of that. And it was just one of those relationships that we had. And as I worked with my dad and got to know my dad from a young age, I realized that if I would tell my dad, hey, Dad, do you want to stop and get a Pepsi? That Dad would take time out and drink a Pepsi because he loved Pepsi. But what I didn't realize is that Dad loved drinking a Pepsi with me. And so from about 8 years old all the way till the end of my dad's life, every time I'd say, hey, Dad, do you want to get a Pepsi break? He would stop and he'd open the refrigerator, have a cold Pepsi, and we would share one together. And that tradition transferred down to my kids. My kids, when they got old enough, they go, Grandpa, can we have a Pepsi break? And he said, yeah, we can. And he'd open the fridge and sit down and he'd share these awesome stories and he'd laugh and giggle and spend some quality time with the kids. And so I'm just remembering these Pepsi breaks, these moments. And I walk into my dad's office and it's empty. And I remember where his desk was and how bad his filing system was and where parts used to sit on the floor. And then as I walked through there, I opened the door and I walked into this big shop with multiple bays. And there'd been heavy equipment and big tools that he'd used to press things out of. And there used to be tractors and trucks sitting all through there. And it was completely empty. And I remembered that was the spot where we worked on the car and we had a conversation. Or I remember where I pulled in my truck and we did some work on my truck and we'd have a conversation. That was the time where Dad and I connected the most, was in this shop space. But now it was completely empty. And as I rounded the corner to look at the rest of the shop, the one thing that I found sitting in the middle of the floor was a Pepsi can. It wasn't flattened, it wasn't crushed, it was sitting upright right in the middle of the floor. The only thing in the entire building. And God said to me, George, your dad is just on a Pepsi break. You're going to get to see him soon. I'm not in control. I couldn't see all those things were going to happen. Like that the one thing that meant the most to me and my dad spending time together was around a Pepsi can, and that God would place a can in the middle of a cleaned out shop floor and say, I got it. I see all things. I know all things. I'm working a plan together for your good. I love you. I care for you. I love your dad. Trust me. There's this passage that's been really helpful to me throughout life, and I just want to share it with you before we go. And it's found in Philippians 4, verse 6. It's written by a guy who was beaten, he was whipped, he was chased by assassins, he's thrown in jail, and didn't know the status of his outcome. He had everything to be anxious about in life. And he wrote this verse, and it says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Be anxious for no thing. Cut it between the O and the T. It's not nothing, it's no thing. Oftentimes, we feel like we've got something to worry about, but God says, be anxious for no thing. That something is really nothing. I've got this. Trust me. I'm in control. I love you and I care for you, and I'm working all things together for your good. Let's pray. God, I just come before you today, and I'm thankful for how you've worked in my life. God, that your promises have been true all throughout life. You've been consistent and steady. And when I think things are out of control, when things seem chaotic, when I feel like I'm sitting at the dinner table having those moments, God, that you're in control of all things and that you are working a plan together for my good. God, forgive me for the times where I don't trust you, where I don't acknowledge how great and how big, how loving, how all-knowing that you are, God. And I just pray, God, that you would continue to work in my life. I pray for those that are in the room today, and it might be a cancer story, it might be a job loss, it might be a relationship issue. God, there might be a valley moment. There might be a moment where they're sitting at the dinner table saying, I feel like life around me is out of control. Whatever it may be, God, I pray that you would show up and say these simple words: be anxious for no thing. Your something is really nothing, because I know it, I see it, and I'm working a plan together for your good. God, I pray that you would move in the hearts and lives of this church and the people in this community, and that you would do what only you can do, God. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Hey, thank you for being here at Southside today. I hope this message was impactful to you, and if it was, will you come back next week? You're not going to want to miss out on the next installment of this message series. We love you guys. Hope you have an amazing week, and hope to see you again next week soon.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you at any of our 3 Sunday services held at Sardis Secondary School on Stevenson Road in Chilliwack, British Columbia. For more information, please visit southsidelife.com.